The podcast you're about to hear includes the story of a Katzie man named Slumach. Members of the Katzie First Nation have been instrumental in us telling this story properly. We acknowledge that the story of Slumach originates from the ancestral land of the Katzie people. What you're about to hear you may find graphic and violent in nature. Listener discretion is advised. The lure of a fortune, said to be worth billions, drew Jack Mould to the mountains. For decades, he had searched Bute Inlet and surrounding wilderness for lost gold mines. Fear of curses wouldn't keep him away, and neither would tales of an estimated 55 souls that had disappeared looking for a legendary mine holding riches beyond compare, yet offering death to those who attempt to find it. Jack had lived in the area for more than 40 years and had often hiked the local peaks looking for caves and abandoned gold mines he believed had been started by the Spanish in the 18th century, and not a brash young man from Pitt Lake. In his search for gold, he was rumored to have found a document mentioning a missing Spanish galleon that sank near the mouth of the river and has never been found. He believed they had found a motherlode. He took note of the location and explored Southgate Peak, 200 kilometers northwest of Vancouver, but then, on September 12, 2007, the 71-year-old prospector was reported missing. The Southgate River is full of downed trees and log jams with zero visibility, which makes search and rescue efforts very dangerous. The risk of being hung up by branches and underwater entrapments is high. Not to mention the danger the river poses, as it's fed from at least 6 glaciers, making the water near freezing. Then there are the grizzly and black bears, cougars and wolves, which were spotted by searchers who were all armed in case of an attack. Authorities found Jack's old vehicle about a kilometer away from the mouth of the Southgate River, where he had been camped. A gun rested beside the vehicle. 2 empty water bottles were found near the river's edge, and his dog was nearby. As they searched the area, they discovered a pair of boots downriver, but there was no sign of Jack Mould. After 2 days of an extensive search, the mission was called off and suspended by the RCMP pending new information. None came, and Jack Mould would never be seen again. I'm Kru Williams, and this is Dead Man's Curse, Volcanic Gold. Episode 9, Jack Mould and Spanish Gold.
Jack Mould. He was this, just, for lack of a better word, insane person up the Bute Inlet.
That's Taylor Starr, the truth seeker on Dead Man's Curse team, and she's not known for mincing words. She says that by the beginning of the 21st century, the curse of Slumach's lost gold mine had mostly disappeared from the limelight. Sure, a TV show popped up every decade or so, but the continued hunt for his gold was limited to mostly die-hard prospectors and local historians. Jack Mould was one of them.
He had this whole operation up there with the Slumach Jackson mine, or however it was worded, whatever it was. I knew that there was something completely off about him. Like he was using those names to benefit from something.
When Taylor says the Slumach Jackson mine, she's referring to Slumach, the Katzie man from season 1, of course. She's referring to the famed Jackson letter that's supposed to be a roadmap to Slumach's gold. You may remember that the Jackson letter mentions a tent-shaped rock and other clues as to the whereabouts of Slumach's hidden treasure. Copied over and over again through the years, the letter was handwritten by a prospector named Jackson, who claimed to have found so much gold that he left most of it behind. For decades, Jack Mould used the Jackson letter as one of several clues to the location of Slumach's lost gold mine. And he went in search of that gold incessantly, mounting expedition after expedition into the untamed Bute Inlet region of British Columbia, almost 200 kilometers northwest of downtown Vancouver, and just over 200 kilometers northwest of Pitt Lake. Most of these operations, which took Mould and his team in some of the toughest terrain in BC, on foot, by boat, by helicopter, would end in disappointment. One ended in his disappearance.
Jack Mould he was smart. He was very cunning, I would say, but greed motivated 100%. So all he cared about was Jack Mould.
That's Don Froese, our way shower from Dead Man's Curse and Taylor's father, who lives in Stolen territory. You may remember that Don warned us both, on TV and on this podcast, that having good intentions before going into the wilderness in search of Slumach's gold is the key to survival. Jack Mould was not known for having good intentions. In fact, he had a bad reputation. His disappearance was the latest in a line of prospectors who went missing in the wake of Volcanic Brown, and some might have been relieved to never see him again. But why? Why was he so disliked? And what was his connection, if any, to Slumach's lost gold mine, Volcanic Brown, or even Spanish gold in British Columbia? Over the next few episodes, we'll try to uncover the secrets of Jack Mould's life, his motivations, his obsessions, his transgressions, which may have brought him in contact with a curse. Jack's journey starts with a story and an obsession. Passed down to young Jack by his father Charlie were tales of Spanish explorers mining for gold in the mountains high above the icy waters of Bute Inlet. It's 80 kilometers long from the estuaries of the Homolko and Southgate rivers at the head of the inlet to the mouth, where it's nearly blocked by Stewart Island. The spectacular wilderness is one of the most scenic waterways in the world and was near where Jack and his father Charlie Mould lived and believed a Spanish galleon loaded with gold sank with precious cargo. They were convinced this mythical Spanish motherlode was the source of Slumach's cursed fortune. But why would Charlie and Jack Mould believe in Spanish gold in the first place? I mean, the Spanish in British Columbia? Well, yes. Let's wind the clock back about 200 years before Jack's disappearance. The Spanish presence along the Pacific coast may not be well known, but it is well documented.
In general, the Spanish are probably the first Europeans to be in the Pacific Northwest.
That's Kru Williams, author and executive director of the Maritime Archaeological Association, a nonprofit organization based in Astoria, Oregon. You see, Vasco Núñez de Balboa became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the New World when he crossed the Isthmus of Panama 260 years earlier. Since then, Spain claimed ownership of the entire Pacific coast of the Americas. By the late 1700s, the Spanish had monopolized trade between Asia and the Americas, but Scott says they never solidified their northern claims.
The Pacific Northwest was always kind of a far reach for them because sailing up here is not easy. It's cold, it's foggy. There's no good harbors really until you discover Puget Sound and a couple of other exceptions. You can't just sort of sail up the coast because of the winds. You actually have to sail pretty far out to sea, out to the northwest, and then back to the northeast to come along the coast. And so the expeditions we do have records of, talk about essentially how miserable it was. It's been kind of a minimal presence, but it's been here since sometime in the 16th or 17th century.
A century later, in the late 1700s, there were rumors of Russian fur traders moving into Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. They reached the ears of the Viceroy of New Spain in what we now call Mexico. He sent Captain Juan Perez, an accomplished sea captain, nearly 50 years old, to investigate. Perez was ordered to sail up the coast from Mexico as far as 60° north latitude, to reassert long-standing Spanish claims in the region. That would put Perez and his ship, the Santiago, near what is now Cordova, Alaska. The viceroy gave Perez explicit instructions to treat all indigenous peoples with respect and to establish friendly relations with anyone he encountered. The Santiago reached Haida Gwaii, the archipelago off the coast of BC, almost 500 miles northwest of Vancouver. Around 200 Haida people welcomed the Spaniards in peace, trading sea otter furs for cloth, beads, and pieces of copper. This was the first exchange of goods recorded by Europeans in the Pacific Northwest. Perez had been instructed by the viceroy to take formal possession of the land by erecting a large wooden cross on the shore, but he didn't. After 2 days of trading with the Haida, without Spanish setting a foot ashore, Perez continued north. The voyage so far had taken months. Food was scarce, and the ship's crew was in poor health. Facing unfavorable winds, currents, and fog, he decided to turn south, despite the viceroy's orders. And on August 7th, 1774, Perez reached an inlet along the rugged, rocky coast of what is now called Vancouver Island. The next day, the Santiago entered and anchored in the inlet, which the indigenous Nuu-chah-nulth people called Moashat. Even though the Spanish did not go ashore because bad weather threatened to run the ship aground, a group from the Nuu-chah-nulth people canoed to the ship to trade furs for abalone shells from California. This was the second exchange of goods recorded by Europeans in the Pacific Northwest. And Juan Perez would be the first known European to explore the coast of what is now British Columbia, Canada. But the most enduring legacy of Spanish exploration in the region is in the names that are familiar to most British Columbians, and even a few Washingtonians from south of the border. At one time, the Strait of Georgia, which separates Vancouver Island from the North American mainland, was called the Grand Canal del Nuestra Señora del Rosario la Marinera. Talk about a mouthful! A shortened version of that name wound up on the waterway separating the San Juan Islands from the mainland just south of Vancouver in Washington state. And many of those islands bear Spanish names: Orcas, Fildago, Lopez, San Juan. On the BC side of the strait, we've got islands called Galiano and Valdez, Texada and Redonda, Cortez and Quadra, and towns on Vancouver Island named Tofino and Port Alberni. All place names, totally mispronounced by us English speakers, that come directly from the early Spanish exploration of the place. One part of the mystery of the Spanish presence and Spanish gold in British Columbia is the fact that many of us simply don't know much about that history. Robin Inglis, professor historian and author of History of Discovery and Exploration of the Northwest Coast, explains why.
Well, I think we tend to feel that Pacific exploration, particularly in Canada and, with a sort of Anglo-centric view of the world, there was no explorer like James Cook. And in many ways there wasn't. But he came here and he did the real first serious maps of this coast. And so everything pales when Canada became, part of the British Empire. In the 19th century, Cook and Vancouver were the great explorers of the coast, and everybody else was relegated to, peripheral players. But of course, Spain had been in Central and South America, since the 16th century. And so it was natural that Spain had an interest. They explored much of the early United States, southern United States. And so they were a presence in that part of the world. So I was always interested, why did the Spanish come here? And why did they, in fact, establish a settlement here on Vancouver Island for 5 years in the 1790s?
Well, the British had already been poking around. Famed Captain James Cook arrived at the same inlet in 1778, 4 years after Juan Perez and the Santiago. But Captain Cook's crew actually landed and interacted with the Nuu-chah-nulth people. He mistakenly took the people's name for themselves and applied it to the place. He wrote down the indigenous name for the inlet as Nootka. By 1789, the Spanish were back, determined to stake their claim on the entire Pacific coast of the Americas. Would they find more riches like the ones they'd discovered in Central and South America? Now, situated on the shore of Nootka Sound, was the native village of Yuquot, a name which means where the wind blows from all directions. As the center of government and of the spiritual and ceremonial world of the Moashot people, one of the Nuchanoth tribes, for almost 5,000 years, Yuquot is the longest continuously occupied site on the west coast of Vancouver Island. When the Spanish returned, Yuquot was already a center of global commerce, with explorers and traders from around the world stopping by to trade European goods for North American furs, many of which would be sold in Asia. Yuquot even became known as Friendly Cove in English because of the openness of the Moashot people to trade. Now, you could say that the maritime fur trade was actually the first gold rush in the Pacific Northwest, both because of the absolute abundance of sea otters and fur seals and the high value of these pelts on the global market. Thick, luxurious, and water-repellent, sea otter furs, in particular, were highly valued by the upper classes in China, as well as in Europe, where they were sewn into coats, hats, and bed covers. In fact, sea otters and fur seals were almost hunted to extinction by the early 1800s by European traders and their indigenous trading partners in the Pacific Northwest. The Russians had the lock on the lucrative fur trade in Alaska, and the Spanish knew the British and the newly independent Americans wouldn't be too far behind. So Spain negotiated a tenancy agreement with the Moashot chief Maquina, who granted permission for the Spanish to build a settlement near Yuquot called Santa Cruz de Nuca, and a fort, San Miguel, to protect the settlement.
It was basically a naval establishment.
Here again is historian Robin Inglis.
And it was kind of a marker to say, look, this coast is ours. The Spanish had, this is crazy when we think in terms of today and First Nations and their rights and everything else. But the Pope in the 15th century had divided the world between Spain and Portugal, so that Christianization of the world could take place, and Spain essentially got the Pacific. So the Spanish always maintained that the Pacific was theirs; it was a Spanish lake, and that this included the coasts of North and South America. It's bizarre to think of these things today, but that was their claim, and so they were already very secure in Central America and South America, and so they wanted to make sure that they were protected from any advances on the north by a hostile power, either like Russia or like England through the Northwest Passage. So they established this naval base at Nootka Sound.
By 1789, European and American ships had been stopping by Nootka Sound for months to trade manufactured goods for furs they could sell for a nice profit in China, and for protection from the often inhospitable weather. In May 1789, Spanish Captain Esteban Jose Martinez arrived from Mexico to establish the settlement for Spain. He was surprised to find 2 fur trading ships were already anchored there, one American and one British. Despite clear instructions to prevent ships from other nations from trading at Nootka Sound, Martinez allowed the American ship to remain in the area for the time being, as the captain had assured Martinez that they would only be there temporarily. But Martinez and his crew seized the British ship, including its cargo of cannons, ammunition, trade goods, charts, and anything not nailed down, and arrested its captain and crew on a charge of violating Spanish sovereignty. Meanwhile, Martinez and his men began to construct the settlement of Santa Cruz de Nuca and the nearby Fort San Miguel in just about 10 days. The settlement eventually included military and civilian structures, such as barracks, a power storeroom, a hospital, vegetable garden, and a handful of houses. This might sound lovely, but the weather was blustery and foggy, and often cold and miserable for the Spanish, who were used to warmer conditions back in Spain and in Mexico. Martinez was holding down the Pacific coast for Spain, just as instructed. But he went a little extra. He wasn't shooing European ships away from Yucatán. He was seizing them, especially British ships, and holding their captains and crews prisoner. Sounds like a pirate to me. One of the British vessels he had captured had a group of Chinese workers and construction materials on it. When Martinez discovered that the captain had planned to build a settlement for the British at Nootka Sound, Spanish sovereignty be damned, so Martinez arrested them. He used the Chinese workforce to expand Fort San Miguel and other buildings in the settlement. It would not be the last time Chinese laborers would be used to build British Columbia. But then, in July of 1789, things got grim, and the exact chain of events is unclear. As we mentioned, the Mohawk people were the original residents of the land around Nootka Sound. McQuina was their chief, and one of the other leaders was Calicum, Chief McQuina's brother. They went aboard the captured ship to meet with Martinez. Calicum was supposedly angry and shouted at Martinez, and in the conflict, Calicum was shot dead. Some sources say that Martinez fired a warning shot, but that a nearby Spanish sailor, thinking Martinez meant to kill and missed, shot Calicum. Another source says that Martinez actually intended to hit Calicum, but that his musket misfired and another sailor shot Calicum. Sources also differ over what exactly Calicum was angry about. Could it have been the seizing of ships? Or something else? No matter the reason, Calicum's death caused bad blood between the Spanish and the Mohawk, who had granted the Spanish permission to settle in the area in the first place. Chief McQuina, understandably in fear for his life, moved with his people from their home in Yuquit, at the entrance of Nootka Sound, to a more secure location further north on Vancouver Island. And much like Slumach and Louis B., a single bullet fired made history. In this case, caused an international political incident involving the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations, Spain, Great Britain, and the United States. It became known as the Nootka Crisis. As word of Spain capturing British trading ships spread, Calicum's death added fuel to the rumors, and news reached London and Madrid. With the Spanish colonial domination and the British fur trade in the balance, this would be a catalytic event that would change the course of Canadian history and set the stage for gold rushes to come. Then, British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger would go on to govern during the unification of the kingdoms of Great Britain and Ireland into the United Kingdom. He is also, you guessed it, who Pitt Lake is named after. Pitt controversially claimed that the British had the right to trade in any Spanish territory they desired, in direct contradiction of established Spanish law. He knew this claim would likely lead to war, but he felt compelled by public anger in Great Britain about Spain's aggression. By May 1790, the British claimed that one of their traders had established a physical presence in Nootka before Martinez ever arrived, and they informed Spain of their intention to establish a penal colony there. Meanwhile, Spain and Great Britain deployed fleets of warships into the Atlantic and would have come to blows if they had bumped into one another, but they didn't. The crisis tested established political alliances among the colonial powers, but it was the decision of the National Assembly of France in the early days of the French Revolution to demobilize its navy and refuse to go to war on behalf of its official ally, Spain. Without French support, Spain decided to negotiate instead of fight. These negotiations were called the Nootka Conventions, and for a while, they would be at the center of global geopolitics. The first Nootka Convention, signed on October 28, 1790, established that the coasts of the Pacific Northwest would be open to traders from both Spain and Great Britain, and that all captured British ships would be returned and an indemnity paid. While the details were being worked out in Europe, which took several years, Spain retained control of Nootka Sound. Further complicating the issue was the changing position of the Moashot and other Nuu-chah-nulth peoples in relation to Spain and Great Britain. After the killing of Calicum in 1789, the Nuu-chah-nulth had become highly suspicious of and hostile toward Spain. In 1791, the Spanish crown sent Alejandro Malaspina, an Italian naval officer sailing for Spain who explored and mapped many of the inlets and islands of the Pacific Northwest to regain the trust of Chief Maquina. Folks from my neck of the woods know lakes, mountains, glaciers, and waterways named for Malaspina, and he spent a month at Nootka Sound to strengthen Spain's relationship with the Nuu-chah-nulth and secure claim to the area. The next year, 1792, Great Britain sent Navy Captain George Vancouver, and Spain sent naval officer Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Quadra to Nootka to negotiate the terms of the conventions. Bodega y Quadra insisted on Spain retaining Nootka Sound, which Vancouver could not accept. In the end, the two agreed to refer the matters to the respective governments in Europe. While that was going on, Vancouver and Bodega y Quadra struck up a genuine friendship. They explored the region together and shared supplies and information. In fact, they respected each other so much that Vancouver named the massive island surrounding the contested Nootka Sound the island of Quadra and Vancouver. This long-form name appeared on maps and charts well into the 19th century, until it was later shortened to simply Vancouver Island, long after both men had died. In February 1793, the Second Nootka Convention was signed and awarded compensation to a British trader whose ship was seized at Nootka 4 years earlier. A month before, French King Louis XVI had been executed by revolutionaries, and Queen Marie Antoinette was imprisoned awaiting the guillotine. Fear swept through the European monarchies, and the kingdoms of Spain and Great Britain joined other royal European powers in the war against Republican France to stop the revolution from spreading across the continent. The British government decided to drop any territorial claims to Nootka to avoid any, quote, useless jealousy on the part of Spain. The Third Convention, signed January 11, 1794, called for both Great Britain and Spain to use Nootka Sound as a port and to build temporary structures. Neither could form any permanent establishment, claim sovereignty, or exclude each other from freely trading at Nootka. They could and would, however, block any other country from trading there. Basically, the British and Spanish went from being enemies to being frenemies in a duopoly of access to Nootka. In the end, Spain's recognized rights of occupation ended at San Francisco, and opening the Pacific Northwest to British traders was a blow to the Spanish Empire. Going forward, colonizing countries could no longer claim exclusive sovereignty over a place without actually establishing a settlement or physical presence. That meant no more orders from the Pope or claims of all the lands touching this ocean or that sea. You actually had to go and settle the land. You had to extract value from the land. If the Spanish weren't trading furs like British and Russians, what exactly were they doing? And if they were experts at extracting gold, silver, and other precious minerals like they were in Central and South America, it makes sense that they might have been doing the same thing here, right? Undercover and off the record.
There's good evidence there were more Spanish ships up here, possibly other European ships, than we have written records of. And we know that from the Native American oral histories.
And Jack Mould's father, Charlie, had a hunch. The Spanish were up to more than what's in the official records.
And so when he had two sons, and when they were in their teens, he took them up to Bute. He told them the stories that he had about the Spanish mining for gold in there.
That's next time on Dead Man's Curse: Volcanic Gold. Thank you for joining me, and special thanks to Taylor Starr, Don Froese, Scott Williams, and Robin Inglis for their work in this episode. Dead Man's Curse is hosted by myself, Kru Williams, and written by Ernest White II and Dila Velasquez. Our producers are Dila Velasquez and Jessica Young. Audio producers are Rosalind Kufor and Rob Johnston. Sound design by Rob Johnston. Our associate producer and Indigenous Cultural and Heritage Consultant is Gail Starr. Our executive producers are Chris Duncombe, Ernest White II, Michael Francis, Kru Williams, Tim Hardy, and David Way. Dead Man's Curse is a production of Curious Cast, podcast for curious minds, and Great Pacific Media. For more information on this episode, follow us on social media, check out our website, and check out our show notes for additional information. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on Dead Man's Curse: Volcanic Gold.